Was your wedding stuff coming? Yeah, I've been there.
Well, I told Aaron that this is a good excuse for me to have to buy a cowboy hat and brand new boots. So, yes, that's what I figured.
Good with boot one, get the ones with the really nice tall ones with all the fluffy stuff on it. Colors.
Yeah.
And you can wear your pants inside and show off.
I got some others.
Hey, James, it's Michael. Hey, so it should be live now. Are you actually getting a feed here? Okay.
Luckily, only a few patients, so I took all day.
Okay, here, I'm going to talk to you for a sec. I'm going to talk to the thing and make sure you can hear okay. Can you hear this all right through the computer? Were you able? Okay, I figured it sounded like it was picking up the volume good enough, but I was fine. Okay, so it should be good. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave it. Okay, I'm just going to leave it on the screen because the way the podium sits, it's off to the side, so that way you can see the screen, you'll be able to hear me talk. So. All right, well, we'll go from here, and then I'll get back in touch with you on the Hangouts once we move to the other room, which I assume will be after the questions. It'll probably take 5 minutes to get kind of situated in another room, or whatever. But I'll give you a call at that point and get you set up, and we'll get set up. So, all right, thanks, James.
Where you said to this too?
Mike always laughs.
One of my committee members is at the University of Minnesota. Committee members.
Hopefully you can see it.
Yeah. So, but there's a lot of other people that are going to watch it too.
But it just said it.
So it worked out pretty good though.
I would text Heather, and then all of a sudden, Mike would talk to me. Like, apparently Heather does not pass the information on Charlie. So,
No, I really get. I mean,
I just laughed because I said, well, I just talked to Heather today. He was like, Charlie doesn't know. I'm like, well, apparently we know how that relationship is.
Yeah, I'm talking to Charlie, and Aaron's talking to Heather, and it's like neither of us talking to each other. So. Yeah. I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, that was like the whole huge thing. And I was like, I don't know if Charlie talked to you, but Mike's got this going on. She's like, no, Charlie didn't tell me. And I was like, oh. Like, what to say?
You guys all better eat something because there's way too much food. I know you are going to eat donuts, so what? You know what? Are you watching your figure now for the wedding? Why would I eat donuts? Yeah, pretty much. Pork fat. But you probably can do two at this point.
I can do it now.
No?
I should do it.
Well, I've seen it all, you guys can go.
Yeah. See you later.
Came back to me. Hey. Morning. How's it going?
We're all set up. Talked to James already. He can see it and hear it. So.
And is that James right now?
Well, he's just one. It's just one way. So,
Okay.
So what we're gonna do is so he can watch the feed on this live stream, and then when we get to the committee, the closed door, we'll go to like the two-way video call. Because this one, there's other people watching. Okay, this is family and stuff. So.
What about Barbara?
She's supposed to be here, as far as I know.
Oh, okay.
She told me she was gonna be here.
Okay.
So
Okay. Great.
we'll go with that. So.
Good morning. Anything good? Is there anything that you need me to do?
No, I think.
Oh, I talked to Corey today about
Okay.
the barbecue.
Oh, okay.
4 p.m.
4 p.m.
Is that
Okay.
okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And that's the address if you want to write that.
Yeah, we can do.
My handwriting is
No,
terrible.
that's all right. Actually, that's a good thing. I forgot. I need to grab my markers for the closed door.
What's going on?
I mean,
Get ready to go to Australia?
Yep. A variety of other places.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How you grad?
Where
else? You told me that. You know who else is going to Mongolia is Rebecca Walters.
Yeah. I remember her.
She's going June 1st.
I don't know where she'll, I don't know where we'll be or where she'll be, but I don't know if she's planning this group or not.
Okay.
But I'll be there like
Huh.
June.
That's when she goes.
Because I show up on the 20th.
And is this for the
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the excuse you.
It's been a lot of fun.
But that's the idea.
Yeah, the project is moving along.
Good. So you're doing that one plus the Australian?
Yeah, so this is just going to be, we want to do one.
So it's sort of exploratory.
And so all the rest of these subsequent trips are going to be.
Yeah, I mean, you might be waiting.
Yeah.
Literally.
So it's pretty inexpensive. Once you're there, so the airfare.
Yeah, it's gotta be. I was like, surely before you guys leave, or
Because
something.
I'm already from Australia.
You, I mean,
So it's a
Terry,
lot cheaper
you.
and I was going to fly to
Then-
so it, like, it all just kind of, it wasn't that much more expensive to get on.
So you go from Australia.
Mhm.
Top part of the second trip.
Yeah.
My supervisor's like,
Maybe barbecue / potluck.
Okay.
I'll remind you. Yeah, your handwriting is much better than mine.
Well, plus I'm like not wrong-handed, so that I don't like smear it when I'm writing.
That's a problem I have. I don't think that's the excuse though. I'll use it though.
There's been a number of times we get done. You'll like write comments or something. I take it Amy like Amy and I are both in there trying to transcribe. So
I'm pretty sure I got this.
Yeah. I saw Lacey write on the board the other day. I forgot where I was, and I was so jealous. I would be so much better if I could draw a straight line. I'm hoping my kids don't have that gene. Their mothers inheritance, or at least can draw straight lines. Anyways, so what else is new? How's the paper?
Slowly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you doing anyways?
I don't know what I'll be working on this summer. It might be tough. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go on and work on this stuff. And this grant is the big part.
Hey, James. One other thing. I'm gonna leave my cell phone here with one of the people in the audience. If for some reason the live feed cuts
Well,
out,
I mean, I
just call my cell phone so they can stop it.
Yeah.
Because I won't be able to tell from where I'm sitting. Okay.
Yeah.
In the nearest future.
Yep, perfect.
About how else to make it happen.
All right, yep, thanks.
Nice smiling
Even if
front row.
you do it, you're still planning on.
Who wants to be in charge of the
Some of
cell
that
phone?
material.
If the feed cuts out, James on my committee is gonna call so that we stop
So
and get the feedback back on.
some of that show-
So
some of
basically, you
that
just have to hold the phone and make sure if it,
show up in that
yeah, if it starts vibrating, just start like, if it says James, then answer Forrester. Yeah, so yeah, if James calls, just start waving because he's the only one that matters. Where I'm at, like I can't really, I'm gonna be looking here instead of there. Like,
I don't know if I'll.
There's a lot of
it
work
just like cuts out.
working on it.
And that's what's recorded.
Yeah, it's streaming live.
Hey, you have a computer?
Mhm.
No, that was
I wanna make sure
It's Lenovo.
we get it out.
It's the 2-in-1.
At the same time.
I'm gonna stick here, but I've got.
So I'm gonna, I don't know why I'm offline. Mine's up over
We'll put that out.
I'm still using it all in my backpack.
Then I'm gonna be. The next one is gonna be like theory, if I can give it my
Well, the Ecology Center just
This-
sent out a
this is-
reminder 5 minutes ago, so everybody's like
Oh,
running down the halls now to get.
I saw Marcia sent out hers earlier.
do you want to keep that before I go?
Yeah, you just tell me what you want.
Yeah.
What? Yeah, we should probably, I don't know which ones it'll be.
Yeah.
How's that one? Is that all it needs?
Yeah, it makes it a little brighter.
Yeah.
So I think the other ones on there are probably fine.
Yeah. You might actually attend to it.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's a race to see who gets it.
We have 2 committee members so far.
I just love it.
So I can
Racing to the finish line.
Just watching.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'd like to see you take the lead on it.
Yeah.
But there may come a point where that's just not.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, think it through.
Yeah.
Why don't you just spend the weekend with them?
Yeah. Take more than that. But yeah.
That's a start.
That's a start. Yeah. 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 I should. I'll try and put some time towards it.
Not an objective.
Just start the rejection process.
I think of one, honestly, as far as.
Yeah.
I've been using that as an example with for others who are doing similar.
I didn't see
Really
that.
lousy reviews.
Yeah.
You had that recently. Sarah Hoy. Good luck. And it's like, just write the editor.
Yeah.
What's there to be? Come this far. You might as well.
Do it while you're angry. That's what I did.
Did you do it?
Well, yeah, I had some inspiration, and then people took it down. But I wrote all this, sent it out to you, maybe 3 people, and people said like, okay, this is good. Harsh here.
So you did get feedback before you have.
I think it's from you, if I remember right.
Amy Corey is.
Yeah.
Oh,
So Corey's the only one.
I can text her. Find out. Text her. Morning, Karen.
Isn't that funny?
I have no idea. Karen?
So Kari.
Sorry.
You know she's in.
Well, she's supposed to be here today.
She's back.
Oh, she is.
She told me she was gonna be here. Last time we talked, she said she'll be here.
Well, I was just in my office and was like, oh, so she might be doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't reach her. We'll make sure.
Yeah. Let's see how we feel after. trying to dance. I'm feeling pretty good.
Yeah.
Just, I think I've got another three.
She's back.
No, no. Remember, someone's like, is she back?
There's a chair right down there. Help myself. Okay.
Hey, Kari. She's a popular guy. Good, how are you? Been a while.
Yes, I know. They're really funny. Can I get you like Should you really say that to someone?
Okay, so I'm gonna go.
Yeah.
So welcome everyone to Michael Kohl's dissertation defense. This is a great day that's been
We've been
long.
waiting for it.
Thanks, Gino.
Thanks, Gino. I was going to say it a little bit more politely, but I appreciate you just getting to the point. So I just want to begin by giving you some background on Michael. So this is just a great time to sort of reflect on what Michael's accomplished up until this point, which is substantial. And I just want to take a moment to sort of recognize what you've done since he and Aaron met with me in 2012, right? Or 2011? Right, I was a fresh faculty, and they came and met with me, and I think Aaron was more skeptical of me than Michael, but he came and had a good experience, and I think one of the first things to realize is where Michael came from. He came from Montana, and so really to begin to understand Michael, you got to understand he's from Montana. He's a Montanan. Always the fact that he's still here is remarkable, that you're not back in Montana. He grew up in a small town, Poplar, Montana, which is on the Fort Peck Indian Reservation. From there, he got his associate's degree at Dawson Community College in Glendive. That was in 2006. And then from there, he went on to get his bachelor's at the University of Montana in Missoula. He finished that in 2008. From there, he continued in Montana. He got a master's with Paul Krausman in wildlife science. He finished that in 2012. And I guess it was right on the heels of that you came down here and started with me.
Straight through.
And Michael's he's been very effective at getting funding and fellowships for all of his academic work. He was a Alfred Sloan Scholar and Boone and Crockett Fellow at University of Montana. And then, of course, he was a Quinney Fellow here in our department. And then he was also a Ford Foundation doctoral fellow for his dissertation. He has about 6 pubs right now that are either in print or in press, including the first chapter of his dissertation, which is in press with Ecological Monographs. So that should be coming out hopefully in the next month or so. If you're really interested, there's a preprint of that that's posted on BioArchive, so you can go online and take a look at that. The other thing to know about Michael is that he's an educator, and he's been involved in mentoring other graduates, master's students, undergraduate students in our department. He has also been educating professionals, working professionals with the Division of Wildlife and others with the resource selection workshop that he's put on twice now, collaborating with Peter Mahoney on that. The other thing that I really want to emphasize about Michael is that he's also an advocate. He's an advocate for underrepresented groups in science. This may not be widely known, but it's an important part of what Michael has accomplished here. He's written a book chapter on getting issues of diversity in the wildlife profession. He's been a chair of the Native American Peoples Working Group for the Wildlife Society. He was a founding member and vice president of our SACNIS group here on campus. He's been actively involved in pushing for greater involvement of underrepresented groups in science, and I think he should really be recognized for that. So with that, I will turn it over to Michael. He'll be talking to us today about the spatial ecology of predator-prey interactions, a case study of Yellowstone elk, wolves, and cougars.
I think you flip both of those about right. Is that good, everybody? All right. Thanks everyone for coming. I imagined I'd have more hair for this presentation, but I guess it is what it is at this point. So before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that you'll see a number of co-authors throughout these different research chapters. So I'm going to refer to we instead of I, because this is a multi-collaborative effort. And so with that, we'll get started. So predators are important components of food webs that influence their strength, their structure and dynamics, with examples documented in marine, freshwater, and terrestrial ecosystems. Across these systems, predators attempt to kill prey, the prey respond, and the consequences of those interactions ripple throughout the ecosystem. Famous examples of these trophic interactions include the removal of sea otters from kelp forests, the effects of bass on phytoplankton in freshwater lakes, the extirpation of large predators from small islands, and perhaps most cited of all, the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park. In each of these cases, predators have the potential to profoundly affect the structure and composition of plant communities through their interactions with herbivores. So I'll show you our simple food chain that I'm going to work through today. In its simplest form, energy is passed from plants to herbivores to the predator. However, through these interactions, carnivores can reduce the density of the herbivore and thus indirectly affect the plant communities. When and how these indirect interactions occur will determine the overall strength and influence of predators on ecosystem structure and composition. Thus, the consequences of these interactions are dependent on the mechanisms that operate between carnivores and herbivores. These mechanisms in the red box here are the focus of my dissertation. So, the first way in which carnivores affect the density of herbivores is through what I'm going to call numerical effects. In other words, a direct reduction in the density of the prey through consumption. So Simba here is going to walk into the prairie and eat all the prey out, right? So with this, there's this release of herbivory. We might observe an increase in plant structure or growth. In other words, the indirect effects of predation. Alternatively, predators can affect the spatial distribution of prey via behavioral effect, where predators induce a movement response in the prey. These effects can similarly lead to an increase in plant growth. Now, it's important to note that these behavioral effects have commonly been referred to as fear effects in the literature. So I'm going to use that language for behavioral effects throughout the rest of this talk. So given these fear effects occur, it's also important to understand that the additional demographic consequences that can occur following these movements into, say, suboptimal habitat. So as the herbivore moves into this less suitable habitat, survival and reproduction can decline, and the overall population may be reduced. This has led to suggestions that fear effects can be as strong or stronger than their numerical effects. The strength of these fear effects have been observed across a variety of biological systems. However, it's almost entirely occurred in these small-scale experimental study designs. That leads to questions whether these fear effects matter in large-scale free-living systems with intelligent predators and prey. In particular, little work has examined how these fear effects influence prey across multiple scales, including from, say, example, the feeding scale to the landscape scale. Second, it's unclear how these fear effects ripple throughout an ecosystem when the landscape becomes saturated with multiple predators. In this case, does one predator chase the herbivore into the jaws of another predator? And then lastly, at the third kind of dimension of this question that I'm going to be asked or talking about today is answering whether or not fear effects have been measured at the correct time scale. So we've measured fear effects in these large scale systems in terms of annual season or seasonal seasons and years. But however, we tended to overlook this idea of the daily activity cycle, the 24-hour dial patterns of these predators and prey, which have implications for habitat use and thus interaction between predators and prey. So as you can see, this is just basically, these are kind of the three focal areas that I'll be targeting with my dissertation. This leads to three specific questions. Does fear drive fine-scale decision-making, and at what time scales? How do prey manage fear from multiple predators? And can fear drive large-scale shifts in animal distribution? So to answer these questions, I focused on the predator-prey interactions within Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone is an ideal study system to address these questions because it serves as the cornerstone for this idea of fear. of a fear effect following the reintroduction of wolves in 1994 and 1995, and because we have extensive long-term data on both predators and prey in this system. Now, my work takes place on the Yellowstone's northern range. That's in the red box. You'll see this polygon multiple times, so just be aware that this is where we're going to be focusing on most of the maps. You'll see things like that. Yellowstone National Park boundary in the black lines here. Now, the Yellowstone's northern range is one of 7 herds that use Yellowstone National Park. It's the only herd that uses the park year-round. This is their winter range. They do move out. Some of the winter range does exist in outside the park in Montana, but generally speaking, they summer here in the winter. They summer here and they winter here. I'm going to focus entirely on the winter range. This is because this is where elk are most highly concentrated in the areas that support browse species. And as you may know, browse is an important component of this idea of a trophic cascade in Yellowstone. So we're talking about aspen and willow species. As a result, this concentration of both elk and the browse species has led to suggestions that this is the period when these indirect effects of predators on prey would cascade down to these plant species. So I'll give you a little bit of background on the elk population, the northern range elk population. I'll walk you through here. So we just got time since 1872, since park establishment, number of elk during those different years. The white open circles here represent, these are kind of, you can take these as best guesses of what we thought the population was before we formalized counting elk on the northern range. Our first formal count started in 1916. These are the black dots. And these were, say, ground counts, or most recently have been aerial counts of elk across the northern range. The gray just represents uncertainty from a state-based model of what those population numbers may have looked like. So some important dates and numbers for elk. This is the presumed low population number for elk, around 1,500 to 2,000 elk. This is following market hunting and the establishment of the park. Wolves were extirpated by about 1926 from the park, and this was followed by a decline in the elk numbers, which was due primarily to elk culling. This was lethal removal of elk from the park, primarily for range health concerns. There was also the translocation of elk out of the park to establish new herds across the Western Rockies. And then, as many of you may know, wolves were introduced in 1994 and 1995. That coincided with what began this reduction in the elk population, although it is important to note that this reduction has only been partially attributed to wolves. So to address the questions about fear, I focused my research efforts during this kind of general period from 1985 onward. So within this time frame, I focused on 3 primary study periods. The first of which is this no wolf period prior to reintroduction. This is from about 1985 to 1990. Next is the period of peak wolves, and I'll show you in the next slide what wolf numbers look like at that time. And then lastly, a period of lower wolf abundance and elk abundance when the populations have relatively stabilized at some equilibrium potentially. So what do our predators look like in terms of those numbers? So during this peak wolf period, we approached nearly 100 wolves on the northern range. At the same time, we also have an additional major predator of elk on the winter range, and that's cougars. There's estimated between 15 and 30 total cats. This includes adults and kittens on the northern range. This is a very relatively high density of wolves for North America, or density of cougars. The low wolf period, as I mentioned, declined with the elk population. Now we tend to fluctuate around about 40 wolves on the northern range. And cougar density has remained about the same for both adults and kittens together. So to monitor elk, we collared large numbers of elk across these 3 different study periods. This was an effort between Montana Fish and Wildlife Parks, the National Park Service, and other partners. This includes 28 VHF collared elk that both inside and outside the park. This represents this is the number of individuals, but these individuals were collared for multiple winters. We had over 150 elk collared from about 2000 to 2006 as part of an effort from Mark Boyce and others in the National Park Service to understand how wolves may be influencing habitat use and demography of elk. And then lastly, this current period that started in about 2012 when Dan started here was focused at USU looking at how how has the wolf population influenced elk in these more recent years as maybe this population has stabilized? So to answer these questions, the first two chapters I use a resource selection design that's based on a step selection function. This is basically a movement-based analysis so that we can quantify how elk are moving on the landscape in relation to predation risk. This includes 27 adult females that were taken at 5-hour intervals. And these animals come from that peak wolf period. And I'll talk in a second why we're focusing on that. What you're seeing here, once again, is that northern range boundary. This is approximately 10,000 GPS locations that are relatively homogeneously spread across the northern range during winter. So 2001 to 2004. Now I focus on these early period, this 2001 to 2004, because this is when ecologists have hypothesized that browse recovery, aspen and willow regeneration was due to a fear effect because elk numbers were still relatively high at around 12,000 elk. Moreover, because predator densities were relatively high at that time, we were more likely to observe some kind of behavioral or fear effect if it did occur. So to monitor wolves, in any given year, we collar about 35 to 40% of the wolf population. From 2000 to 2004, this represented 93 VHF collars. I'll talk a little bit in a few slides about the GPS collars. This started in 2004. I'll talk about the mismatch in timing at that point. Oh, I should mention, what you're looking at here is those elk GPS locations on top of a wolf density model of some form, just to kind of give you a sense where wolves are versus where the elk are. Similar for cougars, we've got kind of a cougar distribution model underlaid on the GPS locations. So the cougar study happened from 1998 to 2006. In any one of those given years, it was estimated that we collar between 68 and 93% of all the available cats on the landscape, adult cats. This included 56 VHF collared individuals and another 10 GPS collars. Some of these individuals are the same ones we collared the VHF, and then we went out and put a GPS collar the next year, or vice versa. So that brings me to my first research chapter, examining the role of diel or 24-hour activity schedules on fine-scale movements of elk habitat selection to assess whether or not a fear effect exists and how it may be mediated by these daily activity patterns. So before I get too far into the weeds of that chapter, I want to step back a second and talk about the landscape of fear, the actual definition of what the landscape of fear in Yellowstone and other places has been. So the landscape of fear is a topographic description of an animal's response to spatial variation and predation risk. High-risk peaks of the landscape are places animals avoid, and low-risk valleys are places they utilize. So in this case, kind of the high blue points represent scary places the animals are avoiding. The valleys represent places they're utilizing. And you can think about these X and Y coordinates as some kind of spatial risk metric. Maybe this is the density of the predators on the landscape or where the predators kill prey. So the significance of the landscape of fear relates to how predator-caused shifts in prey habitat use can trigger an array of indirect ecological effects. This includes changes in prey demography, as well as plant growth and ecosystem function. In Yellowstone National Park, elk avoidance of these risky places, so perhaps these riparian corridors, is a well-publicized idea that's been used to describe the ecological changes within the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, including decreased elk reproduction and increased aspen and willow growth. It's less known, however, that the empirical support for this idea of avoiding risky places is relatively equivocal. For instance, the avoidance of elk of high-risk grasslands has been reported in the literature as positive, negative, and neutral. This brings about questions whether or not we're missing something when we're talking about the landscape of fear. And in fact, the landscape of fear neglects temporal risk. It's focused entirely on spatial risk and ignores this idea that animals may be active or they may not be present at one time and are present at another time. This is in contrast to risk allocation theory that predicts that prey will forage in these risky places during safe times. It's the time that matters, not necessarily the spatial risk itself. So given the potential importance of temporal risk in elk habitat use, studies in Yellowstone National Park have been unanimous about the need to assess habitat use of the prey in response to both spatial and temporal risk. But despite this, studies have almost entirely neglected temporal risk and consistently studied the effects of wolves on elk under the assumption that wolves are always active. They're always there, and they're always present, and they're always scary, basically. So this is in contrast to what we know about wolf ecology and predator ecology in general. In fact, we know that wolves, they, just like us and just like everything else, they sleep for part of the day. They lounge around. They might be sleeping in the midday. They sleep at night. And then there's periods when they are active. And elk, the question is, do elk actually realize this? And are they able to respond to it on the correct timescales? So in ecology, we've been increasingly adept at quantifying spatial risk and measuring its influence on prey species, such as through the landscape of fear. Similarly, we know a great deal about predator activity cycles and how prey respond to them via their own activity schedules. However, ecologists have yet to integrate this information to understand how daily predator activity shapes an animal's landscape of fear in nature. Thus, we're using our resource selection design to quantify whether or not elk are actually responding to spatial risk, temporal risk, or some combination of the both. And with that, we would predict, based on risk allocation theory, that elk should be using these risky places during safe times and only avoiding those risky places when it's a bad time to be there. So to do this, I'll walk you through both, first, initially, the spatial risk metrics, and then we'll talk about temporal risk. So this first map, and you'll see 4 maps here that'll pop up. Red is basically scary. It's a bad place to be. Blue is a good, safe place to be. In this case, this is a predicted kill occurrence. This is basically a resource selection model of where we'd expect to find kills based on, say, distance to roads, distance to streams, vegetation openness, things like that. Next, we look at kill density. You can think of this just as a clustering of kills on the landscape. Where are most of those kills found? And we can quantify whether or not elk are responding accordingly. Next, we look at vegetation openness. This is the amount of open grasslands on the northern range. And so, in this case, you can imagine the red is basically represents very large expanses of open grassland. Wolves are a cursorial predator. They need to chase down and subdue their prey. So they need these big, expansive, long runs of grassland to do that. And then lastly, this is kind of the most common metric that's been used in these elk habitat selection studies, is that some measure of wolf density, basically the clustering of where wolves spend all their time. So for the sake of time, I'm going to just focus on kill density for the rest of the presentation. So that was spatial risk. Now let's talk about temporal risk. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we had GPS collars that started in 2004. This included 21 individuals from 2004 to 2013. And although this doesn't overlap with our elk data, we did a number of retrospective analysis I talk about later that demonstrate that this pattern basically should be occurring, and we expected it to occur during the same time our elk data was collected. Now on the y-axis here, we have wolf movement rate, so kilometers per 5 hours, basically the amount of time it took for how far did a wolf move during that same 5 hours that an elk was moving in our resource selection analysis. We've got time of day, and on this black bar, which you'll see on a number of different graphs, this is just kind of a representation of daylight and nighttime. So black represents nighttime, white daytime, and these gray bars represent the variation in the dawn-dusk period that occurs throughout the winter as the sunrise gets earlier or later. It's also important to note that we see that wolves are crepuscular. They're hunting primarily at dawn period with another peak at dusk. Now, this may not appear to coincide exactly with dawn and dusk, but the way that we calculated this model, it's a cumulative nature of how they move over the last 5 hours. So it just shifts the model 2.5 hours to the right. But if you did this on an hourly basis, these peaks would basically sit right on the gray bars. Yeah, so 2004 to 2013. So to reiterate, what we're interested in is whether or not elk are responding to spatial risk, temporal risk, or some combination of them two. Now I want to draw your attention to 2 points on this graph. The first of which in the green bar is that period what I'm going to call high activity. This is the peak hunting activity of wolves. And then secondly, this period of low activity. I may say sleeping or inactive during the talk. Just be aware that that doesn't mean that wolves aren't active. This is 1.5 kilometers. There are some wolves that are still moving in the landscape. They're just not moving very much. And so there is some risk, but it's just not nearly as much as, say, this point in time right up here. So what did we find? Well, first to walk you through, so this is relative probability of selection. So this is the probability of an elk selecting a place of, say, given risk on the landscape. Here's kill density. Kill density of 0 means there was never a kill really observed there. Kill density of 1 would be a high clustering of kills. And so we see at low levels of risk, the activity levels of the wolves don't matter. And this makes sense, right? If it's low risk, you don't care if a wolf's hunting or not because it's low risk. There's no spatial risk to you at any level. Now, what's interesting is it does increase as risk increases. This potentially could be due to, say, there's more food in these riskier sites. But where you do see strong divergence is when we think about higher risk sites when activity is high or low. And so first, let's think about the green bar here, this low activity period. So when wolves are sleeping or not hunting very much, you can see that elk don't care about spatial risk. They continue to move into the highest risk sites and they use them all the time. Only when wolf activity is high do these become scary places to be and you avoid them accordingly. In this case, you're selecting the highest selection for these low risk sites when wolf activity is high. So that's interesting in itself to think about how elk respond to spatial and temporal risk and kind of a binary high risk, low risk period. But how does this translate to the actual landscape of fear? Because that's what we're interested in Yellowstone. That's what has the potential implications for, say, ecological changes such as browse recovery. So we can combine these two ideas, spatial risk and temporal risk, to come up with some kind of response by elk, and we can quantify the landscape of fear. And so in this case, we've got low activity here. Now remember, in this model, the red, which is just for a subset of the northern range, just to draw your attention to, the red is what we would consider normally in a spatial context to be a bad place to be. This is where you're gonna die. Now the three-dimensional axes represents if you're actually avoiding or selecting for those landscapes. In this case, remember, valleys represent places you're selecting for, that you're using really heavily. And we can see that even though this is what we normally would think about as a place that you're gonna die, elk are actually using those quite heavily when these wolves are selecting, when the wolves' activity is low. In contrast, we see a much different pattern. Elk are strongly avoiding those scary places when wolves are actively searching and trying to kill them in those places. So that's interesting itself, like as I mentioned, to think about this in a binary sense, high periods of high risk, periods of low risk. But we know that both wolves and elk are assessing this predation risk landscape on a continuous timescale. They're doing this every hour of the day, every minute of the day. And so I think it's more informative to think about how the landscape of fear shifts as we move throughout that daily period. To give you a sense, so this is the same map that you saw on the previous slide. The red represents those scary places. The elevation will represent whether or not they're selecting it or avoiding it. The black is just the road through the northern range. If you're aware of the northern range, this is Junction Butte, here's Soda Butte, just to give you a sense of where you're at, but this road just serves as a reference point as we proceed through this 24-hour landscape of fear. As what you can see, during the nighttime periods, when wolves are generally inactive and sleeping, elk are just basically hanging out in these high-risk sites. They're spending all their time there. Only when wolf activity starts to ramp up in those dawn periods do we see this shift where elk are really strongly starting to avoid these scary places. Wolves will start to bed down in the mid-afternoon. Elk go right back into these risky places. And we see there will be a small bump here at dusk when wolf activity peaks a little bit. It's not very strong, but then we'll see, once again, once wolves bed down for the evening, elk go right back into these high-risk sites. So, in conclusion, in the traditional view of the landscape of fear, elk habitat use is solely a function of spatial predation risk. In contrast, the risk allocation hypothesis states that prey habitat selection should be determined both by spatial risk and temporal risk. In addition to this, our study is in agreement with this, as elk only avoided the risky places during short times each portion of the day when wolves were most active. I think another interesting part of our study, which I didn't allude to too much, but has important implications, is that when we look at just spatial risk alone by itself, ignoring temporal activity, we really saw no strong effect, either negative or positive, in relation to habitat selection. They weren't strongly avoiding elk risky places, and that may be because they only really are avoiding that. We have to incorporate time to actually understand how elk are behaving on the landscape. And then lastly, when we think about these effects here, it suggests that any trophic cascade in the Yellowstone National Park is likely due to numerical effects because elk they were able to access browse during these safe times. So next, we're moving on from a single predator kind of fine scale analysis to think about fine scale. And when I say fine scale, I'm talking about kind of this 5-hour fine scale, assessing predation risk in terms of fine scale and multiple predators on a landscape. So this idea of assessing predation risk by multiple predators and how prey respond differs significantly from the majority of predator-prey studies, in which prey spatial response is measured in relation to a single predator species. In such cases, theory and data indicate that prey will avoid the habitats where the predator is most common. So I'll walk you through this kind of hypothetical cartoon, as you'll see this in subsequent slides. So predator effectiveness here on the y-axis, basically you can think of that as, say, the ability to search down a prey or effectively kill a prey, whatever kind of metric you want to think about as how scary this predator would be. On the x-axis, we have some niche axis, in this case a spatial axis. Perhaps maybe this is vegetation openness. Now, our single predator, single prey theory would hypothesize or predict that predators occupy some kind of spatial domain. So maybe wolves like the open grasslands, but prey should do their best to move out of that spatial domain. This limits the overlap with predator and prey and thus should limit their predation risk. It's less known, however, about the simultaneous effects of how multiple predators interact with prey habitat selection, despite the ubiquity of multi-predator systems in nature. How prey spatially respond to multiple predators shapes the cumulative effects of predators on prey abundance and distribution. For example, if a prey prioritizes its response to one predator only to succumb to a second predator, the overall prey mortality could exceed the sum of each of these individual predator-prey mortality rates. So I'm going to refer to this general kind of cartoon as predator facilitation. This is one you can think about as one predator prey running from one predator into the jaws of another. An example in Yellowstone is wolves are effective predators of elk, and so the theory has been, especially in wolf-elk systems, that elk should run from wolves and they'll get killed by cougars when they run into them, trying to avoid the wolves. So what does theory tell us about how do prey avoid this situation? How do they avoid being this predator facilitation? There's kind of 3 general hypotheses that have been used within the literature. The first of which is that predator A and predator B are going to separate themselves according to this spatial domain. They're trying to minimize their competition amongst each other, and so prey should pick some intermediate zone. They're trying to overlap as little as possible with both predators. The second is this idea of predator effectiveness. And so you can imagine both these predators may occupy different spatial domains, but one might be a better predator of that prey than the other. And so in that case, you should select for the spatial overlap with the predator that's less effective. This means your overall mortality would be reduced. And then lastly is the hunting mode hypothesis. Now to walk you through a little bit about this, so you can think about hunting mode as really being broken down to an ambush predator and a cursorial predator. Ambush predators, say cougars in Yellowstone National Park. You can imagine you're walking through the timber and these rocky outcroppings. You know as you're walking through, that's kind of a bad place to be. Something could jump out at you, right? That's the visual cue that prey can use to assess that this is a bad place to be. Cursorial predators like wolves, they need these big, flat, open grasslands. You don't know if grassland 1 or grassland 2 is a better or worse place to be. And so there's no visual cues to tell you that. And so this hypothesis would predict that you should overlap with the cursorial predator because there isn't any of those visual cues on the landscape. In all cases, though, these different hypotheses ignore time in its understanding of the niche domain or the niche axes. So we know that predators separate themselves according to spatial axes. In this case, maybe open grasslands and forested areas. But we also know that prey or predators also separate themselves according to a second axis. In this case, we can think about this daily activity cycle or time. This allows them to minimize competition across multiple axes. So what this does, though, potentially, is increase or move and create these what we call predator niche vacancies. these areas where there's spatial refugia from predators at different times of the day. There you go. So as I mentioned, this is what we've called, this is the vacant predator niche hypothesis. To test this, we're measuring elk habitat selection in relation to wolf and cougar predation risk. This includes both spatial predation risk as well as temporal or the daily activity cycles of these two predators. So we did this using two different metrics. I'll talk about both of them here on these two slides. Vegetation openness and topographic roughness. These are both spatial risk metrics that have been shown in the literature to have implications or be related to how wolves and cougars kill elk. So in this example, a little cartoon, elk want to be out in this open country where there's the most foraged biomass. However, this puts them at direct risk to wolf predation risk during dawn. So they run into the trees in which they would encounter cougars. So the question is, do these vacant niches provide the avenues for them to move on the landscape to avoid both predators? This leads to the prediction that elk should be selecting for this areas of nighttime grasslands and daytime forests. Those are those two vacant niches. For topographic roughness, the predictions are nighttime flat areas and daytime rough areas. So to answer this question, we use the same process, this movement-based resource selection design. We use that elk GPS data from 2000 to 2004. We collected wolf, VHF, and GPS data from 2000 to 2004. The activity schedules will come from that same 2004 to 2013, but this data also provides information on where wolves killed elk. And similarly, our cougar data from 1988 to 2006, we get information on activity schedules cougars, but also where cougars kill elk. We use this longer time frame here just to maximize our sample size for cougars. So just to reiterate, what we're really interested in, does spatial risk, do elk use, for example, this open hillside, is that what's risky? Or is the activity schedule of elk risky? Or is it the combination of these two? So to first do this, we needed to verify that in Yellowstone National Park, topographic roughness and vegetation openness were appropriate metrics for quantifying spatial risk. So to do this, we had 400 kills of wolves, where wolves killed elk, and 257 cougar killed elk locations. And what we did is we built probability of kill models as a function of openness and roughness. Now this actually represents 4 individual models. So the probability of a wolf kill as a function of openness, the probability of a cougar kill as a function of openness, and similarly for roughness. To quantify temporal risk, we did the same thing in this chapter as we did in the first. We used these 21 GPS collared wolves from 2004 to 2013, and we used 6-hour movement data. This is the closest GPS fixed rate we could get to our elk data from 2001 to 2006. And what we do is we calculate, similar to what you've seen, the movement rate by time of day, but for cougars we had to add an additional covariate. This is sex, because males and females differ in how they move on the landscape or the activity cycles. For the rest of the talk, I'm only going to focus on the male data, which was 4 of these 6 individuals, because that best explained elk habitat selection. So that brings us to our model selection framework. What we're really interested in is how do elk move on the landscape as a function of, say, vegetation openness, wolf activity, and cougar activity? Is it a function of 1, 2, or 3, or all the combination of those? So first, like I said, we're going to verify whether or not openness and roughness is an appropriate measure of risk in Yellowstone National Park. So the relative probability of kill, this is similar to our idea of relative probability of elk selection. This is basically where we'd expect to find kills at a given level of openness. And remember here, wolves are traditionally out here, cougars are what we think of as being in this kind of intermediate timber area. And that's exactly what we see. The most of our cougar killed elk occur in this intermediate area. Wolves are killing in that flat open country. We see the exact same pattern for roughness. Wolves are killing in this really flat country. Cougars are killing in this kind of intermediate rough country where they've got some visual obstruction to get close to the prey so they can kill them. So that was spatial risk. We now know that wolves and cougars are partitioning their resources in space. The question is, do they partition them in time as well? So this is the activity pattern from the GPS data for cougars. As you can see here, remember, daytime is in white, nighttime is in black. We see that, in fact, cougars and wolves are separating themselves in time as well. So they're hunting in different places and at different times. Basically, cougars are hunting all night long. Wolves are hunting at that kind of dawn and dusk period. So what that means is that we have established that cougars and wolves are partitioning the resources. They're hunting in different places and in different times. This creates this potential for vacant niches. And the question is, can elk assess that, and can they utilize it? And can they exploit those places on the landscape? So we'll go right into the results to see what elk are doing. Once again, probability of elk selection, openness right here. We've got our activity schedules over here, which you've seen already. This is what elk selection looks like when both predators are relatively inactive. They're basically sleeping on the landscape. This is what we'd expect, right? If there's no predation risk, no spatial predation risk or temporal predation risk, elk should go to where their most foraged biomass is, and that's these open areas. Well, what happens when we think about when cougars are active and wolves are sleeping? So cougars are highly active, wolves are bedded down for the evening. We see this interesting pattern where elk are actually selecting for the most open areas. This means that they're able to avoid cougars, that risky cougar place, and they can go to where the wolves would normally kill them, but the wolves are sleeping. This means it's a safe place to be. Next, we can think about this in terms of when wolves are active and when cougars are sleeping. And we see the counter to this elk selection pattern. We see that highest selection at this point of the day is actually where cougars would normally kill you, but they're sleeping, and this allows them to both avoid that cougar risk, but also wolves that are currently hunting right out here. So they are using these vacant niches. We can show the same pattern for openness or for topographic roughness. Basically, when wolves are active and cougars are sleeping, you're going to where cougars would normally kill you. When cougars are active and wolves are sleeping, you're going to that area where wolves would normally kill you, but they're no longer a risk. Now, that's an interesting way to graphically show that, but I think it's more telling if we think about this in terms of that cartoon diagram of how do cougar and wolves partition their resources, and where do elk select on the landscape. So to first do that, on this y-axis, we've got time of day. Remember, black represents nocturnal periods. The gray bars kind of represent these dawn-dusk periods. And then from, say, 7 a.m. to 1700 hours, we've got daytime. We've got vegetation openness here on the x-axis. What I'm showing you here for cougars is that activity curve across that 24-hour cycle. You can see that the peak of their activity is somewhere maybe around 3 a.m. We can show you similarly the density or the distribution of where cougars kill elk. And we can see there's probably a peak around maybe 175 on our vegetation openness index. What this allows us to do is quantify the actual foraging niche of cougars on the landscape. And so what we're seeing here is quantiles of these two distributions, where you can see that kind of the scariest place for an elk to be would be at 175 at 3 a.m. And so we've provided an idea of what the niche looks like for cougars. We can similarly grab the distributions for wolves and throw their niches on, in this case, 2 niches, dawn and dusk, and show that we can see that, generally speaking, these predators are doing a pretty good job of partitioning their resources. There is some slight overlap, but generally speaking, they're hunting at different times in different places. And so how are elk using that landscape? What I've overlaid here is elk habitat selection in a 2D representation. In this case, green represents the highest selection, blue represents the lowest selection. What we see here is elk are incredibly proficient at selecting that nighttime grassland niche, as we predicted. Now, interestingly enough, we don't see a very strong selection in terms of that daytime forest, but it is important to note that this selection is much higher than, say, when they would be exposed to that wolf predation risk. So between these two, there is evidence that they are selecting for those vacant niches on the landscape. So in conclusion for this research chapter, we show that spatial risk and predator activity created predator predator vacancies that elk were able to exploit. This is important because elk were able to assess or access forage resources throughout the diurnal cycle, suggesting that fear effects did not lead to predator facilitation. Wolves were not chasing cougars or chasing elk into the jaws of cougars. And it's also important to note that this is the first study to demonstrate how prey can integrate time and space to avoid these multiple predators simultaneously. All right, and that brings me to the third research chapter. So lastly, we wanted to evaluate how consumptive and non-consumptive interactions, these numerical and fear effects, may scale up to dictate large-scale spatial distributions. So, given that fear does not appear to be playing a large role in these finer scale spatial and temporal scales, we're next interested in whether fear may play a role at these larger spatial scales. So, to give you a little bit of background, we've seen a shifting distribution of elk over the last 20 years since wolf recovery. What you're looking at here is basically in the darkest black is the highest density of elk. This was in 1987 and 1994, so prior to wolf recovery. But since wolf recovery, this is ended in 2011, we've seen a large shift in where most of the elk are located in the park. Most of the elk have moved from the southeast corner to now reside primarily in this northwest corner outside of Yellowstone National Park. This distributional shift has led some research to suggest that the fear of wolves have led to elk picking up and actually moving across the landscape year to year and moving downriver toward the park boundary in an effort to avoid predation risk from wolves. This provides us a nice avenue to actually assess this question then. So I'm going to do this testing both using some different analyses to look at measures of, say, fear effects and numerical effects. So first, we quantified the annual winter range movement response. Is there a movement response? Do elk pick up and move from one year to the next, either upriver or downriver? All right, so next, we tested for demographic changes in the population that would be suggestive of a numerical effect in an effort to directly compare these fear effects and numerical effects. This first kind of indices of a numerical effect is calf recruitment, calves per 100 cows. The second is adult female survival, and what that looks like across different portions of the park. And then lastly, and I'll talk about this in more depth in a second, age reconstruction, because both of these recruitment and survival have implications for age reconstruction that may lead to subsequent numerical effects. So here's our northern range map again. It's important to note that there's an elevational gradient that happens across this park. And so in these upper elevations, we're at high elevations, winters are characterized by pretty significant snow in a normal year. And that contrasts pretty significantly with these lower elevation areas where this is pretty prime winter range habitat with limited snow depths. I also want to draw your attention to this black dot that goes throughout the thing. This is what I call the river corridor. This is basically our measuring tape of whether or not elk move up or down river from, say, the upper sector to lower or vice versa. It's also important to note that historical evaluations during the 1960s and 80s suggested there's very little mixing between this portion of the park, this herd segment, and this lower herd segment. That gives us a nice background to understand whether or not fear effects. If there was no previous mixing in the 60s and 80s, and we see mixing now where elk are moving from here to here, that would be pretty strong evidence of a fear effect. Oh, and the last thing I want to mention is that these two areas are nearly identical in spatial scale, so that allows us to think about this not just in terms of abundance, but actually density of wolves and elk on the landscape. So what do we see? So here's our elk abundance numbers. We can see that in this lower sector, the light gray, populations have kind of bounced around, but generally reside between 5,000 and 7,000 elk on the winter range. That's in stark contrast with a pattern that we've observed in the upper sector, where today we have very few elk located anywhere in these upper reaches of the park. This does provide support that there has been a there has been a spatial shift. Now, whether or not that's demographic or fear-driven, we'll tackle in a second. How do wolves relate to this story. So in the upper sector, we see that wolf density peaked around 2004. The lower sectors really kind of bounced around, but generally speaking has kind of been consistent around 20 to 30 wolves in the lower sector, whereas the elk wolf population has fluctuated much heavily. Now, since 2009, the density of wolves have been approximately equal in these two sectors. That's an important point to note. Now, I know in chapter 2, I talked pretty heavily about the importance of multiple predators, and here I'm just going to show you wolves. That's because we don't have enough long-term data on cougars to assess spatial risk of cougars at this kind of scale. So we're really just interested in the wolf question at this large spatial scale. So first, the fear effect, the movement response. Are elk picking up and moving? So this is our no wolf study period. This is an important data set because it provides baseline information on what elk did prior to wolf recovery. On the y-axis here, you have their annual movements. So, for example, an elk moved 10 kilometers from, say, here to further upriver, or in the opposite way, they move up in elevation. These parentheses represent sample sizes. So in this case, in 1985, we had 2 individuals that we were able to model their distribution from one year to the next, and then basically those 2 individuals, on average, moved a little bit further upstream. What you can see outside of the 1988 fires, which were catastrophic, changed a lot of the landscape, habitat selection or home range selection site fidelity is relatively consistent. They don't really move a lot from one year to the next. This is consistent across elk as well as most other ungulate species. Next, let's look at this kind of period of peak wolves. This is when we'd expect to see a fear response if one did occur. So remember from our abundance graph, upriver, the dark black, represents an area of more wolves and less wolves. If there was a fear effect, we would expect that most of our individuals would be picking up and moving this way. They'd be moving toward the area of less wolves. In contrast, we see that the vast majority of our outlier individuals that are moving are actually moving up to an area of more wolves. This suggests that there is no fear effect occurring, at least in relation to wolves, and this large-scale spatial shifts. Now, we do see some downriver shift later in these 2012 years, but it's important to note that this is a period when basically densities of wolves are relatively equal, and the only significant difference that's happened since 2010 onward is that we ended the late season cow hunt at the park boundary. This is a significant predation risk to elk as they're leaving the park, and so by ending that late season hunt, we may have reduced or relieved a fear effect from the landscape, but it's not from wolves, it's actually from human harvest. So now let's look at our numerical effects. We're interested in cow-calf recruitment because wolves are a substantial predator of calves during early winter, and so this gives us an idea of how they may be numerically affecting the population. What we can see here is that the lower sector has really fluctuated quite a bit, but the upper sector is relatively consistent, but at these low cow-calf numbers. This is important because 30 cows or calves per 100 cows is kind of a rule of thumb that, like, say, for example, state agencies will use to predict a stable population over time. So we can see that the lower population is kind of hitting this off and on. It's generally bouncing around to a place that we would think that the population would remain stable. The lower population is not coming close. This would suggest that in the long term, this population will be declining. Next, we can look at the probability of wolf mortality. The first thing that's important to note is that regardless of upper or lower sector, wolves get better at killing elk as those elk get older. But there's a significant difference between their ability to kill old elk in the upper and the lower sector. Now, our data doesn't stipulate why this is occurring. It just demonstrates that there is this pattern. Now, this is important because when we think about this difference in upper and lower wolf cause mortality as a function of age, it has implications for the age structure of elk. So what I'm showing here is the proportion of old elk, so 13 or older, where this kind of starts to break apart. And you can see that over time, the upper sector has become increasingly older. That means they're more susceptible to be killed by wolves because of this difference between age-specific survival. And as a result, suggestive of another numerical effect that will further drive the population down. So in conclusion for this chapter, we know that both recruitment and survival contribute to the number of elk in the upper sector. Wolves negatively affect both of these demographic rates. But more importantly, the effect of wolves on recruitment led to an increasingly older elk population. This is significant because as the population becomes older, elk are less likely to become pregnant. This in turn leads to reduced birth rates and subsequently less recruitment in the population. And we know that with less recruitment and wolves effectively killing more calves, these are both working together to further reduce that population over time. Now, similarly, these changes in age structure can lead to reduced survival, given that the older population is more vulnerable to wolf-caused mortality. So we know that this is affecting survival rates in the upper sector. And the end result is this positive feedback loop that's likely sped up over time as the population has aged, leading to a rapidly decreasing elk population in the upper sector. In total, this means that this suggests that the vast majority of the distributional shift that we've seen over time is at this scale was due to a numerical effect. It is important to note, however, that since 2010, we have observed some of these movement responses toward the lower sector, but that's not being influenced by wolves, but rather human harvest. So to wrap all this up, Yellowstone sits at the heart of the debate about the role of large predator restoration and their influence on ecological systems. My research aimed to address how fear may shape these predator-prey interactions across spatial and temporal scales within a multi-predator system. This work has a number of important implications. First off, that ignoring predator daily activity may exaggerate the landscape of fear. This means that those hourly changes in predator activity can rapidly alter the landscape of fear and potentially diminish the ecological significance of this on the landscape. In chapter 2, we show that the use of these vacant predator niches likely reduce direct predation because of a lack of spatial and temporal overlap between active predators and prey. This provided the opportunity for elk to use safe places during risky times. Use risky places during safe times. And this has implications for, say, the trophic cascade of woody browse species. Because elk were able to use these risky places during safe times, this may help explain some of the heterogeneity that we're seeing in browse recovery, and thus the controversy that's come out of Yellowstone regarding whether or not a trophic cascade is truly happening in the park. So more generally, the ability of elk to adaptively forage in risky places during safe times explains why fine-scale spatial responses may not translate to these large-scale ecological effects. This suggests that the ecological effects of Yellowstone National Park wolf reintroduction arises mainly from numerical effects at multiple scales. And so with that, I asked, does fear actually matter? Prior to this work, most of the research has been occurring in small-scale experimental systems, where we've shown that fear can be an important driver of ecosystem structure and function. Here I tested the role of fear in a large-scale free-living system and found that fear effects may not be as relevant to conservation and management as the numerical effect of predators in these large predator systems. This is true for the effects of spatial and temporal scale as well as the diversity of predators. In all cases, fear seems to be of limited importance. Thus, this research highlights the need to further develop our understanding of when and if fear matters in these systems, and if it does matter, when should we expect fear to drive ecological conditions in areas where large predators exist? So with that, I have a whole bunch of funders that come with decades of research that I just like to acknowledge. I also would like to acknowledge my committee members, the incredible collaborations we've had at Yellowstone National Park, a whole host of people here. I'd like to acknowledge the great friendships I've made while we've been here. Wouldn't change a minute for it. And then before I get too far along, since Dan can't stop me at this point, I get to make fun of him. So I asked.
We're out of time.
Yeah, right. I asked around, and I was able to accumulate a number of photos from Dan's time since he was an invigorated young undergrad researcher at Yellowstone National Park, all the way to his tenure track status today.
Okay.
So the first of which is we get to see what Dan looked like in these younger days.
Uh-oh.
And needless to say, the hair is about the same. This is a kind of a cheesy grin for Dan, but this is when he was still excited about the world, I guess. before he took on a bunch of us as grad students, basically.
pre-graduate student.
Right? Dan getting to enjoy field work rather than grading papers. Now, Dan over time has been able to bridge out and kind of spread his wings and enjoy himself during his academic and a career from then to now. And over that time, he's acquired a lot of skills that he's allowed to teach. He's been able to teach us, or as much as we'd be willing to learn, basically. This is how Dan does field work. He basically tells us what we're doing wrong. So, and this is what Dan looks like today during my defense, basically. And trying to understand that confused look that I've been giving him for the last 5 years. So, with that, Dan, I'd like to just say thank you. You've been an amazing advisor. You're one of the best scientists I've ever had the pleasure of working with, and it really has been a good time. So I'm happy with that. And then lastly, I know I'm not going to get through this. Aaron, I know this is more than we bargained for. With a lot of things. You've given me 2 beautiful children. It's been a rough semester, to say the least. But I wouldn't change a minute of it. I love you. Thank you. With that, I'm happy to take some questions. All right, Eric.
You present the science fantastic, great. I'm just curious, somebody from the Friends of the Elk is going to say, why do I have as many elk to hunt? What is your take home to them? They're going to say, we need to get rid of wolves. How do you respond to that?
I think what this shows is that elk are effective predators of elk. Wolves are effective predators of elk. They can have potentially a significant numerical effect on the population. I think this suggests that in places where we're going to manage wolves outside of national parks, that this is evidence that there is a need, if that is your goal to grow more elk, there is a need to manage wolf population numbers. I think what's important to take away from this is, from the flip side of that story, is the environmental groups that may be saying, oh, we need to recover wolves because they have all these ecological benefits. And they do have these ecological benefits, but it may not be as substantial as it's been put forth. And so from that standpoint, you're weighing what people want to think wolves do versus what wolves actually can do. I think that's an important consideration. Tom.
Your big predator niche. Spending too much time on plant trees. But you have a system where your 2 predators appear to be separated in time and space. My understanding of a lot of systems that have multiple predators is they do not. Predators are pretty nasty on themselves as well. How do you think that might adjust your vacant predator niche hypothesis? To squish down the area?
I think it does. I think there's going to be a lot more overlap. We know that in any biological system there is separation amongst these predators, regardless of the spatial scale. I think the separation becomes more dramatic as we scale up to these larger predators. That being said, you can imagine even in our system during the summer, if you add bears to that, you've got another niche domain that's occupied, and so there's less room to operate. I think the take-home message that I'm really interested in putting forth here is that we can't just think of spatial refugia in terms of space only. There's an entire other niche axis that evolution has been developed between these predators that may provide the ability for prey to coexist in these heavy predator-dense landscapes. So I do think it's more complicated as you get to smaller scales with more predators, but I still think this will occur. It's just making sure that we encompass the right components of that niche axis to tease it apart. Yeah, Julie.
Following up on that same chapter, how do you think, you did this over multiple years in elk, have on that?
For the vacant niche hypothesis. So elk density, yeah, has dramatically changed over time. I would say that elk density was relatively consistent during that short window that we did this from 2000. So it's only 3 winters basically. So from that standpoint, it's less of a concern in terms of this exact study, but it is a concern of how that may change from, say, if we did this study that early years and then we reanalyze this data now. One of the things that we've seen in the park over time is that not only has elk habitat selection potentially changed, but predator selection, foraging habitat has changed over time. And this has to do particularly with cougars. So as the elk densities has declined, cougars have moved out potentially into what we consider more wolf habitat because they're following the elk to the better habitat. I think this, in that context, this still has implications in terms of this idea of facilitation, because the whole idea being that elk should be running from wolves and they're just going to get whacked as soon as they hit the tree line. This says that's not the case. I'd have to think more about how this may work in terms of the density of elk, but it's a good question. I'll think more about that and I'll get back to Julie on that. Okay, Julie.
This is about chapter 3.
Yep.
So again, there's a shift over time, which doesn't really get drive anything, but what about snowpack levels and how that might be affecting shifts, and then what would you expect?
So we know that there is, we know that elk do get pushed further down or upriver, if you want to call it that way, or sorry, down toward the northwest corner, the lower elevations in the heavier snowpack years. We know that that occurs. And we didn't account for that in our models. We just don't have the amount of data to do it. But what I can say is that what we did do with this movement analysis is we focused our data from January through March, when the core home range is the most contracted and the most stable. So we're trying to alleviate those. Basically, where they set up shop for the winter is where they stay, and we've seen that once they get there, they don't really want to move much. Now, granted, there could be some massive snow dumps that would change that, but overall, I'm hoping that we've alleviated most of that annual concern. With climate change, we've already seen the effects, although this year is a major anomaly in Yellowstone anyway, where we just don't have winters anymore. Since I've been here at USU, we haven't had a winter in the park until this year. And so from that standpoint, these guys, in essence, you could think about, they're basically selecting their home range based on food availability. And in this case, predation risk, which showed here, doesn't matter. And so that might lead to suggestions that if all things were considered equal and we didn't have alfalfa and other things outside the park, the elk might actually move upriver. And the only reason I say that is because prior to wolf reintroduction, we had 15,000 elk in the northern range. That would suggest that that's the best place to be. That was our densest elk population. And so maybe if we didn't have alfalfa, we'd start to see movements back upriver because we're not going to have any climate to drive them down, and that would be historically the best place to be, but I'm not sure.
Okay, I think we should probably cut it off there. For those of you with questions, you're welcome to speak with Michael after his defense, which will no doubt be successful, I hope. And also, you're more than welcome to ask Michael some more questions, whether it's related to his research or not, at a barbecue at my place Saturday at 4 p.m. this Saturday at that address. And we'll have some food there, but you're welcome to bring other food and drink as well. So with that, I'd really like to thank Michael. Thanks, Michael. I think we'll be meeting here.
I think we're 204.
204. Okay.
So I told James, if you're still watching, we'll get set up, and then I'll call you and get everything organized that way. So.
Like, it's 7 a.m. I should not say. Yeah, actually, I'm still glad you're back.
Good questions, Julie. You want to come to the defense?
That's what I was thinking. Yeah. It's so interesting that at least 4 questions. Yeah. Ditto. And you made me cry.
That's key. It's a lot of years.
I knew I wouldn't even be able to get there.
I'm milling around for a little bit.
Okay.
Let me know when you get out.
Yeah, I assume it'll be 2 hours. So. Nothing.
Yeah, it looks cool down now.
Okay, sounds good.
So let me know when you get
Okay,
out.
sounds good.
Yeah, it should be. Michael. Try to get out there.
Yeah.
How long do you have? I think Charlie's.
Yeah, he's gonna wait to go grab lunch. So.
All right. I'll see you later. I'll probably be back.